The chapel was packed, yet it felt emptier than ever. Marla Higgins sat stiffly in the front row, her black veil hiding tearless eyes. The casket was polished mahogany, glinting faintly in the dim light of the flickering chandelier above. Inside lay her husband, Daniel, dead at 42 from what the doctors called a sudden heart attack. But Marla couldn't shake the feeling that something about his death didn't add up. "Strange, isn't it?" whispered Aunt Clarice beside her, leaning in closer than Marla cared for. Daniel never looked sick a day in his life. Marla nodded absently, her eyes fixed on the casket. The funeral director had done a good job making Daniel look presentable, almost peaceful. Too peaceful. It was as if he were just sleeping, not gone. The priest's voice droned on, his words of comfort falling flat in the cold, stale air of the room. Marla barely listened. Her focus was on the faint sound she thought she'd heard earlier. A soft thud coming from the casket during the wake. She told herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks on her in her grief. But now, she wasn't so sure. As the pallbearers approached to carry the casket out to the hearse, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into brief darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the mourners. When the lights steadied again, Marla felt her heart freeze. The lid of the casket had shifted just slightly, a crack wide enough to see the satin lining inside. "Did you see that?" she hissed, gripping Aunt Clarice's arm. "See what?" Clarice frowned, her brow furrowed in confusion. "The lights went out, that's all." Marla didn't respond. She was already on her feet, pushing through the murmuring crowd toward the casket. Her heart pounded as she reached for the lid, her trembling hands brushing against the polished wood. "Mrs. Higgins?" the funeral director said sharply, appearing at her side. "Please, allow us to handle—" The words died in his throat as the lid suddenly flew open, with a loud bang, sending the room into chaos. Marla stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat. Daniel's eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His hands twitched unnaturally, and a guttural, inhuman moan escaped his pale lips. The mourners scattered, their terrified cries filling the chapel. Marla stood frozen, unable to move, as Daniel slowly sat up, his movements stiff and jerky. His head turned toward her, and his once kind eyes were now black voids. "Marla?" His voice was guttural, stretched, as though dragged from the depths of a nightmare. She backed away, shaking her head. This isn't real." But Daniel climbed out of the casket, his bare feet hitting the floor with a wet thud. His gaze never left hers as he stumbled forward, his hand reaching out. The air grew cold, and the smell of earth and decay filled the room. "Why did you let me die?" Daniel rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. Marla felt the world spin as the memories came flooding back, things she'd buried deep, things she never wanted to face. But there was no time to process. Daniel was getting closer, and she knew, deep down, that he wasn't the man she had married anymore. Marla stumbled back, her heel catching on the edge of a pew. She crashed onto the cold stone floor, her breath hitching as Daniel loomed over her. His face was pale and gaunt, with shadows that sank deep into his hollowed eyes. Black veins snaked along his neck and hands, pulsing faintly as though something vile coursed beneath his skin. "Daniel, this isn't you," Marla whispered, her voice cracking. His lips twitched into something resembling a smile, but it was grotesque, cruel. "You think I don't remember?" His voice was like gravel, unnatural and layered, as though two voices spoke at once. The pills, the lies, The affair Marla's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. But before he could respond, a crash shattered the tension. One of the mourners had knocked over a candelabra in their desperate scramble to escape, and the flames licked hungrily at the thick carpet near the altar. Smoke began to fill the chapel, but Daniel didn't seem to notice or care. His dark eyes remained fixed on Marla. "You let me die," he hissed, crouching low. "But I woke up, and now I'll make you remember." Marla scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned and ran, her heels echoing loudly as she bolted down the center aisle. Behind her, Daniel's shuffling footsteps grew louder, faster. Outside, the night had fallen into an oppressive silence. The town's streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, uneven shadows across the churchyard. Marla ran toward the rows of gravestones, their jagged edges jutting out like teeth against the dark horizon. She tripped over an exposed tree root, landing hard on her knees. "Marla!" Daniel's voice bellowed behind her, closer than she expected. She crawled forward, her hands scraping against the damp earth. Her fingers brushed against something hard and cold. A rusted shovel leaning against an old oak tree. Without thinking, she grabbed it and turned, swinging wildly. The shovel struck Daniel's shoulder with a sickening crunch, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he grabbed the handle and ripped it from her hands, his inhuman strength sending her sprawling. "You think you can stop me?" he growled. "You can't bury the past, Marla. It always comes back." From the corner of her eye, she saw movement, shadows shifting unnaturally among the gravestones. As she struggled to her feet, she realized with growing horror that the graves around them were stirring. The ground cracked and split, and skeletal hands began clawing their way to the surface. "Daniel, stop this!" Marla screamed, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't me," he replied, his voice trembling now. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of her husband's true self beneath the black void of his eyes. But then, he convulsed violently, his head snapping back as an unholy scream erupted from his throat. The other figures were rising now, dozens of them. Their faces were half-rotted, their empty eye sockets glowing faintly with an eerie green light. They moved toward Marla with slow, deliberate steps, surrounding her in a tightening circle. "Run!" Daniel's voice broke through the chaos, softer this time, almost pleading. "Before it's too late." Marla hesitated. Was it a trap, or was the man she loved still fighting to protect her, even in death? She didn't have time to decide. A skeletal hand grazed her shoulder, and she bolted, weaving through the graves as the undead clawed their way toward her. Ahead, she spotted the wrought iron gates of the cemetery. But as she neared them, the air grew impossibly heavy, and a deep guttural voice echoed through the night. "You cannot escape." Marla froze. The voice wasn't Daniel's. It was something older, darker, and far more powerful. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, as she saw Daniel standing at the center of the cemetery, his arms raised. The ground beneath him glowed faintly, etched with symbols she didn't recognize. "This isn't about me, Marla," he said, his voice a blend of his own and something far more sinister. "It's about us, about what you took." The earth trembled violently, and the rising dead turned their hollow eyes toward the glowing symbols. Marla's knees buckled as the realization hit her. She wasn't just running from Daniel, she was running from the truth. Marla's legs trembled as she stood frozen near the cemetery gates, her breath forming clouds in the icy air. Behind her, The rising dead swayed like a macabre tide, their hollow sockets fixed on her with unrelenting malice. At the center of it all stood Daniel, his silhouette framed by the eerie green glow emanating from the cracked earth. Marla? Daniel rasped, his voice carrying the weight of something ancient and unholy. This isn't just my reckoning, it's yours too. I don't understand, she screamed, tears streaming down her face. What do you want from me? Why are you doing this? Daniel's lips twisted into a grotesque smile as he took a step closer, the ground beneath him splitting with each movement. You know why? You always knew. Memories crashed into her like a tidal wave. The late nights filled with whispered arguments, the tension that had turned their once loving home into a battlefield. The pills she had slipped into his evening tea. Not to kill, she had told herself, but to silence the anger, to calm the storm. And then the guilt when his body gave out. No, she whispered, shaking her head violently. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I didn't mean to kill me. Daniel interrupted, his voice rising. Or didn't mean to free it. Marla's heart stopped. Free what? The spirit bound to our blood, Daniel snarled. The curse you ignored. You thought burying me would bury the truth, but you've only unleashed it. The air around her grew heavy with a suffocating pressure, and the glow beneath Daniel's feet flared brighter, revealing the intricate sigils carved into the earth. Symbols she had seen before, faintly scratched into the foundation of their old house, the one Daniel had inherited from his family. Your family's secret, Marla said, her voice trembling. The stories about the Higgins curse. They're real? Daniel nodded, his movements jerky and unnatural. It wasn't just a story. Our ancestors made a pact, Marla. A pact with something beyond this world. It promised wealth, power, and long life in exchange for devotion. But when the family broke the pact generations ago, it cursed us instead. I didn't believe it either. Until I died. Marla stumbled backward, her stomach churning. But I didn't know. You didn't care, Daniel roared, his voice booming across the cemetery. You thought you could play God, that you could erase your guilt with his death. But now, the spirit that haunted me is free, and it wants blood, yours and mine. The skeletal figures began to move again, their decayed hands reaching toward her as the earth cracked and groaned beneath their weight. Marla's fight or flight instincts kicked in, and she bolted toward the gates, her breath ragged. But the gates didn't budge. The iron bars felt like ice beneath her palms, and no amount of force could pry them open. She turned, her back pressed against the cold metal as the undead advanced. Marla, Daniel called again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. You can end this. You can undo what you've done. How? She shouted, desperation clawing at her throat. He gestured toward the glowing sigils beneath him. The pact can be sealed again, but it requires a sacrifice, a willing one. Marla's heart sank. You want me to die? Daniel shook his head. Not just die, you have to take my place. Bind yourself to the spirit, offer your soul so the rest can be free. Tears blurred her vision as the weight of his words crushed her. The undead were closing in, their hollow moans growing louder. And if I don't? Daniel's eyes darkened further, black as the void. Then it will take us all, you, me, everyone in this town. The spirit will consume everything. Marla clutched at the locket around her neck. A gift from Daniel on their wedding day. The memories of their life together flooded her mind. The laughter, the love, the promises they had made. She had betrayed him, but maybe this was her chance to make it right. "Fine," she whispered, stepping forward. "I'll do it." The ground trembled as she approached the glowing circle, the sigils pulsing with a malevolent energy. Daniel's expression softened, the monstrous facade briefly giving way to the man she'd loved. "You don't have to," he began, but she cut him off. "I do," she said firmly. "I took your life. Now I'll give mine." Marla stepped into the circle, and the glow intensified, enveloping her in searing light. She felt the spirit's presence immediately, a cold, unrelenting force that clawed at her mind and soul. It whispered promises of pain and eternity, of despair and redemption. As the light consumed her, she heard Daniel's voice one last time. "I'm sorry, Marla. I never wanted this." And then everything went black. Marla awoke to silence. She lay motionless on the cold ground, her body aching as though she had been pulled apart and stitched back together. The cemetery was eerily still. The groaning undead, the glowing sigils, the oppressive voice of the spirit, all of it was gone. She pushed herself up slowly, her breath catching as she realized she was standing in the middle of the circle. The ground beneath her feet was scorched black, the symbols burned into the earth like scars. Beyond the circle, the cemetery stretched into a dense fog, the gravestones barely visible in the gloom. "Daniel?" she called, her voice weak. For a moment, there was no answer. Then faintly, she heard a voice. His voice, carried on the wind. "Marla?" She turned, searching desperately for him, but the fog seemed to shift and swirl, hiding him from view. "Daniel, where are you?" "I'm free," he said, his voice soft but clear. "You saved me. Saved us all." Tears welled in her eyes as relief and grief washed over her in equal measure. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "for everything." "I know," Daniel replied. "And now? It's your turn to carry the burden." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands gripping the scorched earth. "What do you mean?" As if in answer, the sigils beneath her flared to life once more, burning with an otherworldly light. She screamed as a cold, suffocating presence invaded her mind, her soul. The spirit was there, inside her, its voice echoing in the deepest corners of her consciousness. "You belong to me now," it hissed, its tone laced with malice and triumph. "No," she cried, clutching at her head. "You said this would end it." The spirit's laughter filled her mind, a sound like shattering glass and howling wind. "The pact is sealed, mortal. You are my keeper now, my voice, my vessel. This is your eternity." Marla's screams echoed across the cemetery as the truth sank in. She had taken Daniel's place, but the spirit's hunger would never be sated. It would use her to whisper its dark promises into the ears of the living, to lure others into its web of despair. The fog began to clear, and Marla found herself standing at the edge of the cemetery. The town lay below, its streets quiet, its windows dark. Everything looked as it had before. But she knew nothing would ever be the same. She turned and saw Daniel standing near the gates. His face was peaceful, free of the torment that had twisted it before. He smiled faintly, sadness lingering in his eyes. "You can fight it, Marla," he said. "You're stronger than I was." But as she reached out for him, he faded, his form dissolving into the mist. She was alone now, with nothing but the spirit's cold laughter to keep her company. The cemetery gates creaked open on their own, and Marla stepped through, the iron bars slamming shut behind her. The sigils on the ground faded, leaving no trace of the nightmare that had unfolded. The town slept peacefully as Marla walked its empty streets, her shadow flickering unnaturally in the dim glow of the streetlights. Somewhere deep inside her, the spirit stirred, whispering its dark secrets. She knew she couldn't stop it, but she also knew she would fight it for as long as she could. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Marla turned toward the rising sun. Her life as she had known it was over, but perhaps, in the quiet moments between the spirit's whispers, she could find a sliver of redemption. The wind carried a faint echo of Daniel's voice, a reminder of what she had lost and what she had gained. "You're not alone, Marla." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe it.